A reading from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. The word of the Lord. Have you ever found yourself standing among the rubble of your house, looking at the burned heap left over from the fire, or the collapsed stones from an earthquake? Or maybe you've spent time abroad in war-torn areas, standing among the rubble of a home or a building that's been bombed, razed by the evil forces of war. For me, that moment came when I was walking through Coffeyville, Kansas, a small town where I was staying with my aunt for a summer. That spring, a supercharged flood crested the levee at the local oil refinery, and 71,000 gallons of crude oil spilled out into the waters, condemning all the soil and homes in its scorched earth path. All through town that summer, the scars of that ecological and human disaster remained. Houses with oil lines 4 feet high and X's on their doors condemning them. A town in rubble. This week, like so many other weeks in the past year, we're flooded with images of buildings collapsing under the weight of snow, bursting pipes, flooding homes with freezing water, rolling blackouts, leaving millions in the cold. The images are a disturbing complement to the harrowing shots from only months earlier of fires in California, of charred homes in relief against the fire-tinted orange skies, or the image of flooded homes from hurricanes throughout the Southeast. Pick a name from the litany: Harvey, Irma, Florence, Dorian. These natural disasters are anything but natural. The ability of these supercharged storms to reduce entire towns to rubble is the result of the way our society has systematically mined God's creation, reducing our earthly home to rubble. Friends, we are no longer standing in the time before climate change. We're not looking at it as an event to prepare for in the future. The question before us is not whether we will prevent the destruction of the world. The question is how we might build structures of courage and vision out of the rubble we're standing in. Because like Nehemiah, we find ourselves standing in the rubble of our home, God's good creation. It is a rubble that is not entirely our making, but it is a rubble that's our inheritance. Nehemiah found himself in a similar position. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians a century before Nehemiah's lifetime. Yet Nehemiah could see beyond the status quo. He had vision to see reflected in the rubble the possibility of the restoration of the once magnificent walls of Jerusalem. He had courage to see the restoration of the Jewish identity in the face of imperial forces that opposed it at every turn. Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem and sought to rebuild the walls from the century-old rubble. He left his charmed position as cupbearer to the king to go to the land of his ancestors, going in faith to a city in shambles, hoping to rebuild a wall, and with it, a renewed Jewish identity. This story of Nehemiah rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem is received differently in this era. Wood walls are frequently symbols of national strength and fascism, designed to protect the right or white way of life from the corrupting other. In an awful irony, walls constructed by empire to maintain a way of life are holding out precisely those forces which the empire has enacted through climate change. And these walls of empire are on display with every climate disaster. Walls of privatized companies insulating and warming the wealthy in Texas, while the poor neighborhoods freeze to death. Walls of private firefighters protecting the mansions of Malibu elites, while the residents of Los Angeles lose houses and breathe in toxic fumes, unable to afford even an air purifier. The wall snaking along our southern border, stopping the movement of people and animals, movement that is driven by the effects of climate change created by us. These structures of empire aim to absolve developed countries from responsibility for our role in the climate crisis. Nehemiah's wall is characteristically not a wall of empire. It is a wall designed for people to move in and out of with gates and openings. It is a wall not built by the well-funded resources of the empire, but from the rubble by the hands of the people. We enter into Nehemiah's story after the construction has begun. In the chapter preceding, in chapter 3, the author illustrates the grassroots effort of the people of Jerusalem, listing out in those 32 verses the names of some of the people who worked together. I spared you from reading the litany of chapter 3, though I honestly can't deny that I was tempted. Ultimately, I decided I would probably make a fool of myself trying to pronounce all the 42 names. But it's amazing what you find in chapter 3. The entire chapter is a testament to the people gathering together, working to repair the wall, the priests and the people, the rulers and the ruled, working side by side, each making repairs to the wall in their own neighborhood. 42 men are listed by name in this chapter, a level of notoriety granted to only a prominent few in the book. But why spend a chapter writing the names of people who worked building a wall? Perhaps the author of Nehemiah wants to emphasize that the rebuilding of this wall is not like the walls of empire, built on the backs of oppressed people and slave labor. It is the people's work, standing side by side, rebuilding from the rubble of their own neighborhoods. It is not the work of the anonymous and well-funded military-industrial complex, but the hands of neighbors who, in the face of threats all around, courageously work with all their heart. Images of structures courageously built from the rubble of climate change are found all around the world. The church forests of Ethiopia offer a moving image of what it looks like to build religious structures that include and invite, that make space for the thriving of life in the midst of ecological crisis. In the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the proper way for a church to be a church is to be enveloped by a forest. The priests of this ancient Orthodox tradition, one of the oldest of the Christian traditions, recognize that the spiritual possibilities of a church don't arise solely from the interior space, where one might encounter God, but through the invitation of creatures to be part of the sacred structure. It is not the work of human hands alone that builds the sacred structure, but the work of God in partnership with all of God's creation. These forests are ecological arcs of biodiversity in a landscape flooded by deforestation. Seen from above, the church forests are small pockmarks of green, only a few acres in size, surrounded by a landscape of brown. The juxtaposition is severe, circles of lush green trees with domed huts in the center, surrounded by a desertifying landscape. The forces of empire threaten them on all sides. As climate change intensifies, Cattle ranchers are under more pressure to find suitable land for their livestock. And desertification is eroding the boundaries of these church forests, destroying the revered places of ficus and juniper. In response to the rubble of these deforestations, church leaders partnered with local ecologist Alamayehu Wasi to build a solution: walls around the forests. The idea was to extend the inner wall of the church, that which demarcated the Kirusei Kirusan, the Holy of Holies, to move that outward, encompassing and protecting the forest from forces of destruction, so that all of the forest might be the Holy of Holies. Gathering stones from the desertified areas outside the forest, teams of robed priests and bespectacled scientists went about building a 3-foot-high wall around the perimeter of the existing forest. And the result has been magnificent. Tree regeneration has accelerated. Biodiversity has increased. By keeping out those forces of ecological destruction, the wall has made it possible for the expansion of life on the inside, preserving a remnant with the vision that someday these species might have more habitat to reproduce in. People and animals are invited into the refuge, a place for regeneration of life and spirit. The story of these church forests challenge us to ask, if the majority world church is Nehemiah, rebuilding the walls from the rubble of climate devastation, then who are we? In the scripture, the response of Sanballat to Nehemiah's work on the wall provides a foil for the work of God and the people of God. Sanballat is the governor of the neighboring province of Samaria, someone whose power is threatened by Nehemiah's presence and by the astounding organization of people power. He is, perhaps, a typical ruler, one foremost interested in maintaining his own political power. And he says what the powerful often say in response to crisis: "What you lowly people are doing is useless. You think that your hands alone you can rebuild this wall?" And yet, while the powerful military leader ridicules the Jews, he inadvertently asks the most profound question of the passage: can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble? Meant to be a jab at the weakness of the people in the face of military prowess, Nehemiah turns Sanballat's question against itself. He prays to God, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Do not cover up their guilt. Blot out their sins from your sight." The question before us: will the church choose to work in solidarity with those standing in the rubble of climate disaster? Or will we continue to revel in our own privilege, insulating ourselves from the suffering of other creatures? Will we choose to be Nehemiah's neighbors, or will we choose to be Sanballat's soldiers? Will we fight alongside those most affected by the climate crisis, or will we fight to maintain our own comfort and power? Will we ask the question, can these stones be brought back to life in ridicule or in courage and vision? Ministering in the climate crisis means building from the rubble, creating spiritual, communal, even physical structures that can withstand the storms of the climate crisis. And in the face of a crisis so wide-ranging, this is not something to be relegated to Earth Day Sunday. The rebuilding of the wall became the mission of the people of Jerusalem. And you don't have to be an Ethiopian Orthodox Church to be a refuge for life. Consider the way the climate crisis is reducing your local context to rubble, and seek to be a force of rebuilding. Plant trees. Preach courageously. Welcome climate refugees. Advocate for political forces of renewal rather than political forces of destruction. In courage and vision, we pose the question to God: can we bring these stones back to life from these heaps of rubble? May we continually pray this question and bravely work as if the answer is yes. And by the grace of God and the work of our hands, something beautiful might arise from the rubble. Amen.